Hello everybody, it's your friendly digital technology librarian Christy here. We've reached another Friday, so of course I have another Film Rec Friday ready for everybody out there. So last week we kicked off Noirvember with a number of neo-noir titles. So it's only fair if we go old school this week and talk about a number of classic film noir movies. So if you're not already familiar with the genre, these picks are definitely going to give you a great starting point into the entire genre, as well as be great ways to find yourself sucked into the world of dark and cynical cinema. So as always, these films are available to you entirely for free with the use of your Milan-Berlin library card. And without any further ado, let's get to the recs. Okay, so our first pick is available on DVD and Blu-ray via our CleveNet service, and that is 1944's Laura. Laura is one of those movies that's iconic, not just within the film noir genre, but within film in general. It's pretty much required viewing for film study majors. It's one of those big-time movies. I believe AFI even named it one of the best 10 mysteries of all time. I believe it's also one of those films that's part of the National Film Registry with the Library of Congress, and it's considered culturally historical or aesthetically significant. It's a biggie. And there are a lot of reasons why. So, overview. This movie follows a Manhattan detective. His name is Mark McPherson. He's been put on the case of the murder of this really visible socialite named Laura. The main character, the more he looks into her murder, the more he kind of gets swept away by her persona, and he ends up kind of falling in love with this dead woman. He interviews all the people in her life, and he discovers all of these little bits and pieces, and we're left with clues, and we sort of have to put them all together in real time, just like McPherson is doing. And that's generally how mystery movies work. However, there is a massive twist within this whole storyline that really blows the whole case wide open. The urgency is suddenly, increased tenfold. It's just an incredibly well done film, especially when you think about the time that it was made. The themes that they're talking about, like the things that actively happen, the things that are said on screen. I mean, it's a very interesting movie. I love the way the actors all have incredible chemistry together, whether we're talking about people who are antagonistic towards one another, or you're talking about lovers or friends. It's all very clean and very tightly woven, and it's just a really good mystery movie. I definitely think through the lens of today's viewership that some of the shocking things might not feel as shocking, but again, when you put it in context, when you put it in the time period, it really is quite groundbreaking in a lot of ways. And there's a reason why at the time it was nominated for Best Director, Best Picture, Best Cinematography. I mean, it's really quite something special. And the films today that sort of pull from things that that happened in this movie, or the way that they approached the filmmaking aspect of things, I mean, there's a debt of gratitude there, So if you are looking for a very well acted, really well plotted out mystery that has incredible chemistry between the actors, that has just the kind of story that you get caught up in, definitely check out Laura. It's a classic for a reason, and you absolutely won't regret putting it on your watch list. Okay, next up, available for both streaming and download via our Hoopla service, is 1944's Woman in the Window. Woman in the Window is one of those movies that is frequently referenced as kind of a jumping off point for the entirety of the film noir genre. You can definitely see echoes of bits and pieces of this movie in films that are doing mystery, thriller, dark, cynical cinema even today. I mean, There are a lot of tropes that I think were probably birthed in this particular movie. And yeah, they're tropes, but they had to start somewhere, and they started because they were incredibly effective ways of storytelling. And I do think that Woman in the Window is an exceptional example of that. So, in this particular film, we are following a professor named Richard Wanley, played by Edward G. Robinson, an incredibly massive actor at the time. He ships his family off on a vacation out in Maine, and he's expecting to have, some nice, relaxing, quiet time all alone. He ends up going out and spending some time with some friends, and they all kind of end up enraptured with this portrait of an incredibly beautiful woman. They happen to meet the woman upon whom this portrait is based, and she and the professor kind of hit it off. She invites him back to her place for drinks. He accepts. It's a product of its time, okay? He accepts, and then once he gets there, all of a sudden her boyfriend appears in a jealous rage, and murder ensues. And this thing snowballs out of control so quickly. Um, Really, while I was watching it, I was pretty shocked. I had not seen this before. My plan to put these classic noir films for you. And a friend had recommended this was her favorite one of all of the film noir movies that she'd watched. And I can absolutely see why, because it just goes crazy. And again, when you think at the time of the code and the rules that films and filmmakers had to abide by, it's incredible that it was able to slip past the censors, because some crazy things happen in this. Like, seriously, like, throw your morals out the window immediately on this movie. Like, immediately. And it just gets more ridiculous as the film goes on. Not ridiculous in a bad way, but just like, it's like, who were these people? We just sort of jump into the movie and we think we know what types of characters these are, but by the end you're definitely not sure of anything anymore. And I really, really appreciate that about this film. So Woman in the Window is actually based on a novel by J.H. Wallace, and that novel was called Once Off Guard. It came out in 1942, and there are a couple big twists within both stories. One twist solely in the film. Um, the director of the movie, as mentioned, had a ton of things that he had to sort of abide by in order to get this film made and processed by the censors, that potentially, had he stuck even closer to the source material, would not have happened. And while I would say today you might have a little bombastic side eye at some of the things that he chose to do, really at the time you would have been quite caught off guard. I mean, they would have been exceptional plot twists. Like I said, a trope is a trope for a reason. Yes, easily identifiable, but it's easily identifiable today because it's happened so much due to a film this as successful as this. So it's one of those movies that you kind of have to have that awareness of, like, time context. This isn't a movie that came out today. It's a movie that came out in 1944 and grandfathered all of these other films ever since. So I really love that about this. Not to mention the fact that Edward G. Robinson is always an interesting actor. Sometimes he's definitely, in other roles, very over the top, but there are large portions of this where I felt it was more organic and authentic a performance than in some of his other more lauded roles, which is quite curious to me, because the things that he's lauded for I've always thought were like pretty bombastic and like out there and over the top. And I don't know if that's purely like a product of the time, like the kind of acting that I'm used to versus the more presentational style that he was performing. But there really is something interesting about the way he portrays Professor Wanley in this. And I do think people who have watched a lot of film will really appreciate seeing the nuances that he's able to put into this particularly outrageous character. So if you are looking for something that really sort of changes the game in this particular genre and in film storytelling in general, make sure that you check out 1944's Woman in the Window. Again, available on Hoopla. Absolute must watch. Okay, final pick for this week. It's available for streaming via our Canopy service, and that is 1955's Night of the Hunter. This movie is certainly one of my top favorite film noir movies, but also one of my favorite films of all time as well. There's a bit of a nostalgia factor to this. I remember the very first time I watched it was with my grandfather. My grandfather was the person who sort of launched my love for cinema. And this movie is one of the very first times I can recall having a real in-depth conversation about a film with him. Um, Even as a kid, there were aspects of this movie that bothered me so much. And flash forward 30 plus years, and those aspects still really, you know, evoke a serious emotional response in me. And I think that's just kind of the sign of an incredibly well made movie. And I strongly urge people to check it out. So, Night of the Hunter follows this sociopath named Harry Powell. He presents a beautiful picture of himself. He's very charming. He is supposedly this preacher, but he's actually a murderer who targets a very specific kind of person and family. And this film is all about his plot to involve himself in a new target family. When we first meet him, he's already in prison. He's doing time for theft. He meets a man who's on death row for murder. This murderer is named Ben Harper, and Ben confesses to Harry that he has like $10,000 worth of stolen loot, and that the only people who know anything about it are his children. So what do you do when you're a sociopath? Once you get out of prison, you make that family your target, and that's what Harry does. He is released from jail. He becomes obsessed with uncovering this $10,000 treasure. He tracks down Harper's family, and he manages to charm this man's widow into taking him into her family and marrying him. So he's now, legally in charge of this family, and it's just horrifying. He has presented himself as such a charming figure to the entirety of this town. So when things start to get dark, there's really nowhere for these people to turn. There's nowhere for this widow and her two kids to go because, well, Harry wouldn't do that. Reverend Harry is such a good man, and it's almost exhausting while you're watching this. All these things happen, and again, you have to think about the time that this was made. This movie is dark, like dark, and it doesn't shy away from just how horrible this character can be, and it's just really fascinating to me that there wasn't more blowback. So what's super interesting is that upon release, there were tons of negative reviews. It was not well received critically. And now it's considered like one of the greatest films ever made. It's on like BFI's best movies list, AFI's best movies list. I mean, it's on tons of critics' favorite. It's interesting to think about the context of that. What changed? Certainly not the story, but the way that we view it, and what changed about society that is like, oh, okay. Because and you really do have to wonder where that shift happened. Robert Mitchum is a phenomenal lead in this. He plays these sort of overwhelmingly charming psychopaths so well. He's also the lead in the original Cape Fear. If you haven't seen Cape Fear, and I'm not talking about the De Niro version with Juliette Lewis and Nick Nolte, that's the remake, which has its own pros and cons. But the original version, and he's again just really this incredibly charming lunatic, and there's just, I don't know, it's something about the way he carries himself, the way he sort of internalizes all of these things that are happening that just make him so effective in these roles. And I've seen him in tons of things that where he's not playing like a murderous human being, but he's just so good at it. And Night of the Hunter, I think, is the peak of him playing this kind of a character. You've got direction by Charles Laughton, who is quite the notable film noir director. Shelley Winters is in this, Lillian Gish, the two children. And I've said this on multiple occasions. Child actors for me are so hit and miss. I will almost always prefer a movie that doesn't have kids in it simply because there's so many moments where the casting is just like egregiously bad. And the acting is just horrendous. But this is not one of those times. These two kids are on it. And I want to avoid spoilers, but one of the big things that have always affected me, and still I still get to have this knee-jerk reaction to it, involves these kids. And, you know, I could see myself watching this in 20 years and still feeling the same way. So if you're looking for something that has stellar acting, incredible direction, really, really good story, that absolutely pulls you in, you 100% have to check out Night of the Hunter. It's an absolute must watch and definitely my personal pick of the week. All right, so those were my picks for classic film noir movies. If you happen to have any recommendations for old school film noir films, please comment with those below. If you have any recommendations for themes you'd like to see us follow in the future, definitely share those with me. As always, thank you so, so much for joining me, and hopefully I will see you next week. Bye.